So what did I make of the Nick Diaz comeback bout? A fight week that overall was among the nerviest that I've ever experienced. I felt as though there were just too many unknowns and new developments to really comment on things ahead of time through a video on fight week, as Nick bounced between stances on his upcoming fight. And I think that, as many people have pointed out, Nick making strange or worrying comments in the lead up to a fight is not really as odd or out of place as some of you might have thought. Indeed, this was an older Nick, a more world-weary Nick, but in some ways, I couldn't help but feel like there was a certain level of peace emanating off him at times. Not peace in the traditional sense, but I found a sense of purpose in the way he spoke about training the next generation, something that seemed far removed from his angst-ridden prime years. He didn't want to be a gangster anymore, instead opting to set a good example. But as these interviews continued, and Diaz began to speak about his reasons for returning, how tough the last few months had been, all while alluding to a botched business deal that saw him lose out on the opportunity to open up a school, to follow what seemed to be his calling in life. That's when I felt that Diaz's reasons for making this late career return became more clear. I've followed Nick Diaz for years now, and he's without question my favorite fighter, and my favorite personality within the sport of mixed martial arts. And though there were a lot of fans who had their first real, drawn-out exposure to Diaz through the build-up to UFC 266, all his talk about being nervous, scared as hell, and only returning because it's the only thing he knows how to do, yeah, that didn't faze me too much. Nick has always been painfully honest, emphasis on painful, unable to filter or front, often speaking out of a place of anxiety only to totally backtrack and say the opposite thing when he's in a different headspace. And he's willing to go to places in front of a camera that most fighters wouldn't dare. And clearly it's that vulnerability, that realness that has endeared Nick Diaz to the fans over the years. But yeah, over this fight week, while there were some troubling signs, some things that indicated that Nick really didn't want to be there, I have always found Nick Diaz interviews to be troubling to some extent. And I mean that in terms of this guy's overall career direction or career choice, or lack thereof. He has always been the guy who is gifted by an elite ability to compete as a fighter, while being cursed by the fact that he can't escape the responsibility of these gifts. And while this fight week was certainly the most dramatic example of Nick being Nick, for me, the most worrying thing ahead of time was the physical shape he was in. I've seen pictures of Nick Diaz within the last year that saw him shredded, that saw him looking in far better condition than even his best years in Strikeforce or the UFC. But I suppose my main takeaway as I watched the weigh-ins, the promos, the media day photo shoots, it wasn't that Diaz's hands looked slow during the shadowboxing video shoot, or even the words that came out of his mouth. But I definitely got a knot in my stomach when I saw his frame, and it puts the last-minute move to middleweight into perspective. Ahead of the fight, I guessed that Diaz had hastily booked his return, seemingly left with little option after that aforementioned business deal went wrong. According to his longtime teammate Jake Shields, he was pressured to take the fight with just a 6-week training camp. And whether that's true or not, even at the age of 38, Nick Diaz looked ill-prepared for this bout. If he had shown up in incredible shape, in the type of shape that he was pictured in just a year prior, I think the mood would have been very different amongst the fans ahead of this clash. And I think judging on the fight that we actually got, I really believe that if Nick had come in better condition, just a bit sharper and more physically in tune with the task at hand, I think it was clear that he probably would have beaten Robbie Lawler. Because if we're going to speak about the fight now, regardless of how I feel about its existence, Nick looked pretty good in spots, showing boxing and volume that called back to his best days in the sport. I watched that first 30 seconds between the gaps in my fingers, honestly, praying that Lawler wouldn't just rush him early and get him out of there. But after surviving a bit of an early storm, Nick actually started fighting back, firing off combinations that, while slow and uninspired, were still pretty effective. His lead hook to the body in particular looked as sharp as ever. And I think that the fight overall served more so as proof of Diaz just never losing it, more than anything else. Because he did look slow, his movements labored, and though his experience and octagon savvy allowed this fight to go on further than it perhaps should have, I think Nick himself was well aware of what exactly was transpiring in there in real time. And don't get me wrong, I actually loved the fight for what it was. That said, it was as difficult a contest to watch as I've ever experienced. And even through the confidence that was slowly building within me as I watched Nick grow into the bout, he looked so awkward at times that I couldn't help but feel as though things were about to take a turn for the worst. And when they did and Nick went down, I'll be honest and say that my heart went right down there with him, folks. And I think after after the tone that Diaz set over the course of fight week, the vibe that he gave off that confirmed beyond any doubt that he just didn't want to be there. Yeah, when he signaled to the referee that he was done, I nearly jumped out of my chair. I really hate the MMA attitude towards quitting, the just bleed attitude that doesn't really have the same presence in boxing. It's an attitude that's stuck in the 1990s, stuck within a more primal version of what is now a much more elegant sport. And I think that Nick Diaz using his sense and opting out in that moment was a truly beautiful thing to experience. People go off saying that he did it for the paycheck, like they've never done anything in their own life for a paycheck. But no, he didn't try to fool us in the build-up to the fight, and after delivering 2 rounds of extremely high-volume action, he decided in that moment that he'd given us enough, and I commend him for that. Because this man has earned his stripes. And with that, the freedom to take ownership over his time in the octagon. On a side note, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with all of our latest uploads, before leaving a comment to let YouTube's algorithms know that we are fast becoming one of the best MMA channels on the platform. So yeah, it was a good fight. A really unique experience among the thousands upon thousands of bouts that I've watched in my life. And to be honest, I'm still kind of unpacking how I feel about it. Obviously, I haven't mentioned Robbie Lawler at all, but it goes without saying that this man is a legend. And it also should be stated that he turned up in a big way for this fight, overcoming his own obstacle after a few gun-shy performances of late. MMA as a sport all but guarantees a weird and ugly life cycle if you stick around for too long, where if you don't get out like GSP or Khabib, you're likely to end up as a BJ Penn. And when it comes to allowing these legends of the sport an opportunity to earn a living, feeding them to the new rising prospect seems like the best way from a promotional standpoint to make some sort of return off of the years of investment you've put into their growth. It's almost like, well, I helped BJ Penn become a star and a legend, so let's just feed him to Yair Rodriguez in a no-win situation so he can capture some of that old, long-forgotten momentum. Again, it's ugly, and it leaves you feeling a bit empty, in full realization of how this sport, and in a more broad sense, how life itself operates. But I didn't get that on Saturday night, and I think that's the real victory here. Robbie performed admirably, showing us all that he still has some fuel in the tank, some ferocity to unleash under the right circumstances. And Nick Diaz showed us that he's still a fighter. He's still able to get in there and put on a thrilling contest. And if I may reiterate, I firmly believe that a more in-shape version of this Nick Diaz would have been able to pull off the victory, because I was surprised to see how good Nick's hands looked in parts. He was just kind of slow, sloppy, and rhythmically poor. Now, of course, I am managing my expectations here. I don't want to see Nick fight again unless Nick himself wants to fight again. Or if that's too much of a grey area, unless Nick himself wants to fight for a reason that doesn't stem from necessity. And if he does want to return, give him Demian Maia or Ben Askren, maybe even Cowboy. I don't need to see him in there with Jorge Masvidal. I'm afraid my wee heart would not be able for it. But all in all, the fight week, the bout itself, and the finish that left fans divided, I thought it was a pretty compelling piece of MMA theater. I didn't know how this video was going to turn out, because as I mentioned before, I'm still unpacking my feelings on this one, but I do think that this was more of a celebration of Diaz and Lawler, rather than some upsetting love letter to their best years. And at this point in their careers, that is certainly good enough for me. But what did you make of this hugely interesting week in MMA history? And would you like to see Nick Diaz make another walk? And if so, who exactly would you like to see him in there with? Do let us know your opinions in the comment section below. We always love to hear from you guys. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and a comment before subscribing to the channel so you can stay up to date with all of our latest uploads. Thank you for watching.